Greetings, growers worldwide. Jordan River here, back with more Growcast, having fun in the sun. Today, we are talking about the sun. Dr. Coco is back. This is a really great episode. The episodes with Dr. Coco are always good, but this one takes a really unique look and approach. We're talking about the differences between indoors and outdoors. And for today's episode, we really are only able to get into the sun versus your grow light, mostly. It's a huge deep dive. I know you're going to love this episode. Before we jump into it, though, shout out to AC Infinity. Code GROWCAST15 getting you 15% off now across the board at acinfinity.com. Now, there's been some changes to the code that I need to tell you about. First of all, like I said, it's now 15% across the board. For a while, it depended on what you were getting, or it was 10% off, or the discount didn't apply. They're trying to send people to the website. So what do you get now? GROWCAST15 is the code. 15% off all items at acinfinity.com, plus free shipping on orders $99 or more. So they're sending people to their website. Code GROWCAST15 saves you a chunk on the best fans in the game. Grow tent kits, lights, scissors, pots. My favorite grow tents out there. Whatever you need, grab it from acinfinity.com and use code GROWCAST15 for 15% off. Plus you get free shipping, $99 or more at the website acinfinity.com. Plus on Amazon, if you're still going to order on Amazon, GROWCAST15 saves you 5%. So go ahead and grab what you need, a whole new tent setup, some scissors, some sleeves, some sunglasses, whatever you need, grow tent stuff, grow gear, it's all there, acinfinity.com, code GROWCAST15. Thank you to AC Infinity. All right, and just a reminder, our grand pheno hunt starts February 15th. Check it out at growcast.com/hunt. That's growcast.com/hunt. Wanted to let you know before we get into the show. Thank you for listening, and enjoy that show. Hello, podcast listeners who are now listening to Growcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in again today. Before we get started, as always, I urge you to share this show. Turn someone on to Growcast or turn a smoker on to growing. That's the best way you can help us on our mission of overgrow. Make sure you're subscribed. GrowcastPodcast.com is the website. There you'll find everything, the show, the seeds, the classes, the membership. It's all up there. Huge special thank you to all the members for making this thing possible. Today, we've got a great friend of the show back on the line. You know him. You love him. It's been a minute. Dr. Coco from CocoForCannabis.com is back with us. What's up, Dr. Coco? How you been, man?
Hey, Jordan River. I've been doing pretty well. It's nice to be back on with you, as always.
You know, today we've got a really cool episode lined up talking about indoor versus outdoor, talking about grow lights, talking about the sun, all this stuff. But before we get into it, what have you been up to? How's Coco for Cannabis doing? The challenges, the forums, and everything over there?
It's going pretty well, man. We're getting geared up for the next New Year's Grow Challenge. It's going to start on January 1st. So, if you guys are interested in growing along with us, come on over to Coco for Cannabis, check out the challenge page, get signed up. And we're excited to roll that out again. And we've been doing the New Year's Grow Challenge since 2018. So what is this? The 7th annual?
Jeez.
It's always a lot of fun. I've been working on some interesting projects. I'm doing a collaboration with Lettuce Star, which is a diode manufacturer. I'm going to go through and do this video teaching growers about the different types of horticultural diodes, what you want to look for in grow lamps, what you don't necessarily need on grow lamps. Grow light manufacturers use different types of diodes or different combinations of diodes and kind of answer a lot of questions along those lines. So it's been an interesting project, and Lettuce Star's been a great sort of collaborator with that, with hooking me up with all sorts of inside information. So I've been enjoying that. And I've been developing these new grow light metrics, and I'm starting to premiere those. So looking at a calculation for operating costs. So I'm starting to report when I test lights, how much this light will cost you to run for the course of a typical grow.
Wow.
To better be able to sort of compare different lights in terms of operating costs, which is one of the factors in terms of getting a more efficient light, is that you can have lower operating costs. But we often talk about this, 2.3 micromoles per watt or 2.4 micromoles per watt, and seeing how that actually translates into, well, this one's going to cost you $180 to run for a grow, and this other one's going to cost you $230 to run for a grow.
Right. And I can imagine that's pretty complex too, right? With like energy prices, Do you factor in like replacements and damages and stuff? Or
Just the operating cost
okay,
of the light itself. So we're just looking at basically power draw over the course of a typical grow, and then the cost of electricity. I'm putting them into the grow light calculator where people will be able to put their own cost of electricity, in terms of cost per kilowatt
oh,
hour.
nice, that's huge.
Yeah, but for the videos and sort of the standard metrics that I'm sort of publishing about the lights, it'll just be the USA average, which is
Sure,
16 and a half cents per kilowatt hour.
is that right? That is the average cost of the
Yeah.
electricity going into my grow light.
Yeah, across the country. Some places are cheaper. You live in Louisiana, it's cheaper. If you live in California, it's more expensive.
Sure.
But that's the average. So as long as that's held consistent, you can see at least some idea of how much more expensive one light is than the other. But the other metric that I'm doing that I'm even sort of more excited about, I call tent heat factor. And this is how much hotter a light will make a typical grow tent. So when you think about the lights on temperatures versus the lights off temperatures, everybody that's ever grown in a grow tent knows that when the lights go on, the temperature goes up, but by how much? And the relevant variables there are sort of the power of the light, the space that you're growing in. And then every grow tent is a little bit different in terms of how people have ventilation set up and all of that. So, it's fairly easy to calculate BTU per hour from any electrical appliance.
Right.
And if you're installing HVAC systems, like dedicated HVAC systems, that's the number you need to know is the BTU per hour. But if you're in a grow tent in your living room, me telling you it's going to be 2000 BTU per hour probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. You're trying to use your living room as a lung room and you got an exhaust fan. And your relevant question is, how much hotter is it going to make my tent than the light I'm currently using? Or how much one light versus the other light is going to affect how hot my tent runs? So based on a lot of personal experience, discussions with, lots of different growers, came up with a formula to sort of estimate how hot a light will make a quote unquote typical grow tent
Wow.
in terms of plus how many degrees Fahrenheit. So like the light I just tested, Mars Hydro FC6500, that's 720 watts, would make a 5x5 space about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer when it's on than when it's off in the typical ventilated grow tent.
Sure.
If you put that same light into a 4x4 space, it's going to make it about 15 degrees warmer in the typical ventilated grow tent.
Wow, just by the size of the space being different. That's interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
the lights all ran at 100% power, probably, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but when I tested at a lower power setting, I'll publish the the tent heat factor
Oh, that's sick.
lower power setting, which is really sort of the relevant variable. So all these things that we've been doing in the past, like measuring the surface temperature of the light, that's almost meaningless.
Right.
Talking to home growers about BTU per hour, basically, I don't think any information is translated in those kinds of conversations.
No.
But this one's going to make your 10 degrees hotter. This other one's going to make your 13 degrees hotter. And you're thinking, well, shit, I'm already pushing, 83, 84 degrees in my tent. I better not, bump that amount of light up, or maybe it's going to be better to go with the more efficient light that's going to produce less heat.
That's extremely useful. Or if you're in a basement, maybe you're looking for that number to be a little bit higher. I know I battle with cold in my basement.
Exactly. And you might be sort of questioning whether, some of these more efficient lights or whatever would be enough heat for you. So I think that that's really the number growers need. Like when I turn this light off versus when I turn this light on in my setup, how much hotter are things going to get? And I think that they can kind of work with that and decide if they can manage with that.
That's really cool, man. That is a very useful piece of advice. I'm
Yeah.
always interested to see what you're working on, like you're always up to something.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about these. I've been thinking these are going to be, because, we've been saying for years, and like Migro's always said that like the PPE number, the photon efficacy number is like the most important number about a grow light. And it's like, okay, but why? These are the reasons why. It directly affects operating costs and it directly affects the amount of heat that's in your tent. And I think that drawing attention to those two variables, as opposed to just this abstract, like 2.3 micromoles per watt,
Mhm.
talking about plus 10 degrees Fahrenheit and $160 a grow or something. I think those are numbers that growers can make better decisions.
That's great, dude. Very good job breaking down and communicating that type of stuff and
Right,
pushing
yeah.
the boundaries about how we think about cultivation. I think that's really cool, man. And it ties in perfectly for today's episode.
Yeah, I thought it would, thinking about the differences between indoor and outdoor grows.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it started with what I wanted to do is talk to you about an episode about the sun.
Yeah.
That's where this started, was like the sun. And then that kind of expanded into like the sun versus a grow light, obviously. And then it expanded this idea of like just the difference between being outside, not within an indoor domicile,
Yep.
and out in nature. There's so many nuanced differences. And I think you and I could probably, explore these and make some really good educational content. I'd like to start with this idea and kind of get your opinion on it, because it's something I see growers do a lot. When you read grower forums, when you're in, my server, grower servers, something you see people say, and I'm sure you've seen this, is a grower will say, I'm doing this for this reason. And one of the reasons why I'm engaging in this strategy or this process is because I'm trying to mimic what happens in nature. Well, that's what happens in nature, right? So I'm trying to mimic what happens in nature.
Yep.
And I think it's a really interesting concept, because sometimes that leads growers to do good things. Sometimes that is absolutely the right answer, and it is a positive impact in their indoor grow. But other times it does not translate one-to-one at all, right?
Yep.
So I'd love to start there before we move on to lights specifically. Like, what about this idea of trying to mimic nature inside your indoor grow tent?
Yeah. So like at a very broad level, the 30,000 foot perspective here, we need to mimic nature. Like plants need light, they need water, they need some place to put their roots down and grow them. They need minerals to be able to uptake, to perform basic biological functions. And, if we're going to grow them in exotic conditions, like inside a Mylar grow tent or something, we do need to mimic all of those things, but in basic, like they need to exist, right?
Sustenance wise.
Yeah. In a lot of cases, we try to improve each and every one of those over kind of what the plants would experience in quote unquote nature or outdoors in a farm or whatever, right? So, thinking about the place to grow their roots, like we either use prepared peat medias or rock wool or cocoa or, growing in DWC in sort of conditioned water. We're trying to give the plants an ideal rooting media, not just some place to put their roots, right? And that's an improvement over kind of the random soil that plants are going to find in nature that they can set their roots down in. At least we're trying to give them like improved and ideal media, right? In terms of climate, to a certain extent, plants are evolved to grow in specific environments, right? And we need to more or less mimic that environment where the plant is growing. But again, that's sort of the 30,000 foot perspective. When it gets down to the nitty gritty, outdoors in nature, plants experience a lot of swings in climate and in temperature and seasonalities that they basically have to survive. They're not necessarily things that are helping them to thrive. So sort of their ideal climatic parameters aren't always met outdoors.
Or rarely met.
Yeah, exactly. Rarely met. They're oftentimes a little too cold, a little too warm, a little too wet, a little too dry, a little too whatever. And over the long run of things, plants are able to survive and sort of adapt and become hardier, to kind of preview something you're going to get to. But that's part of it, right? Is that plants outdoors kind of have to struggle a little bit more. They're not getting all of their needs met perfectly all of the time. And that slows them down. It gets them to invest more energy in other aspects of the plant. The plants in an indoor ideal climate don't end up having to sort of invest energy in, because they're not being stressed.
That makes sense.
And so that energy is able to go to other things, right?
Bud production.
In our case, it's the development of the flowers.
Yeah.
Right?
Trichome production. That answers a large portion of my question, because we talk about like what's better, what's optimal. right? And it's like, well, from our perspective, if we're just trichome farmers, like a lot of people say,
Yep.
that's one thing. But like, there's that meme, right? There's that meme that you see online: indoor plants versus outdoor plants.
Yeah.
And the indoor plants is like the weak little Shiba dog sitting there, and it's like, I'm sorry, the left side is actually outdoor plants, and it's like the beefy Shiba dog, and it says concrete, cozy, right? And then the indoor one's like, is this tap water dechlorinated? I've observed that for sure, Dr. Coco. Like, that is a phenomenon I have observed. And you're saying it's because they're exposed to different stressors and they utilize that energy in different areas than if they were just catered for hand and foot.
Well, let's think about this just again, in really broad strokes. How long do most outdoor plants veg?
Much longer than
months.
Yeah.
Right? And how long do most indoor plants veg? Weeks. Like, I mean, there's a real quantitative difference there in terms of the amount of time that we're investing in the plants in terms of letting them grow up. And again, sort of the broad strokes in terms of comparing indoor and outdoor. Indoor, we can speed things up. Outdoor is way cheaper.
Yeah.
So you have kind of the juxtaposition there. When you're growing outdoors, you can invest months in veg because you're not investing anything in climate control. You're not investing anything in lighting.
So true.
You know what I mean? So you can invest time in growing.
Get a huge yield too.
Yeah, but you wait all summer. You get one harvest per year. You move indoors, you invest a hell of a lot more energy, right? And the whole goal at that point is let's grow these plants fast and get them to invest all of their energy in the parts of the plant that we want them to harvest, basically. So we don't need these plants to be super strong in terms of weathering different climate shifts or in terms of weathering different temperature shifts. We're going to keep them really close to their ideal temperature range the whole way, so they don't have to invest energy in that, and they can just invest energy in their flowers. But yeah, if you take one of these plants and suddenly bring it outdoors, it's going to struggle mightily, right? Because it's not prepared for that. And it is going to wilt or die or any number of other things, depending on kind of what climate you move it out indoors into.
Yeah, you're so right. Since we bred them in that environment and put them in this environment, we don't need those things. So it's good that they don't. You know what I mean? Like they're not meant to survive outdoors. They're meant to produce trichomes.
This is more an individual development issue rather than sort of an evolution thing where it happens kind of in the genetics between generations. Like we can take the same seeds from the same seed pack, grow 5 of them indoors, 5 of them outdoors. You're going to end up with plants that are different in terms of like everything we're talking about, right? So it's not that one has kind of been evolved to grow in indoor situations and the other is going to evolve to grow in outdoors. But if you took those indoor plants, the 5 of them from the same seed pack, and, sometime in the middle of flower, moved it outdoors.
I see what you're saying.
It's going to struggle a lot more than the 5 that had been growing outdoors
100%.
all along.
That's so true. And I've also seen after a while, they kind of like the ones that survive, like you said, if they can make it past that tough point, they kind of acclimate. They get stronger. They do grow up, like you said. They start talking with the microbes outside. And there's an adjustment period. It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like someone going through SEAL training. It like makes or breaks you,
It's actually called hardening off.
There you go.
Where the plant has to get toughened up before it can survive well outdoors. So oftentimes in cold environments where growers do their starts in greenhouses or indoors and then move their starts outdoors, they'll go through a hardening off process where they'll move them out or expose them to those conditions for a couple hours one day, and then like 4 hours the next, and then 6, and then finally put them out there so that it's not sort of too much for them all at once. And plants do adjust to that and become hardier, hardened in that process.
That's crazy.
And yeah, so in indoor plants, we're almost trying to grow soft plants. I keep thinking, and I haven't thought through this metaphor deeply. It's never occurred to me before, but I'm kind of thinking about veal.
Yeah. You of all people are thinking about veal?
Yeah, it's like we're trying to keep them soft and kind of give them the perfect food,
Yeah.
the perfect conditions to grow kind of the tastiest product without them having to worry about, getting out there and walking around and actually, defending themselves. So we pamper the hell out of indoor plants.
That's fascinating. We don't want the hardy bison species with the shaggy coat to survive the winter. We don't need it. We want that succulent, just about the
Right.
flavor. Yeah.
This is kind of what's happened in modern varieties of agriculture outdoors too. If you look at, I'm famous for bringing up corn, but if you look at the difference between the corn that the farmers that I work with in Mexico grow, which once it's planted, a lot of that corn will grow and produce an ear of corn, even if the farmer completely neglects it after that point.
Well,
If you plant a field of corn in Iowa and then completely neglect it, you ain't getting any corn. I mean, the plants will not have enough nitrogen to grow. They won't be able to do it. They absolutely depend on prodigious use of fertilizers in order to sort of grow and produce that. They can't weather pest attacks the same way that the crops that I grow when the farmers in Oaxaca do. They can't deal with those things because they're used to getting sprayed with pesticides. They're used to getting lots of nitrogen fertilizer, and they're bred to grow very fast. And if they're not getting that nitrogen fertilizer, that doesn't allow them to grow fast, and they just, grow scrawny, whether they never grow big enough to produce ears, and they'll just die.
right.
So we grow these plants in a lot of conditions. When we can take control of certain aspects of them, then we can grow them bigger and faster. And it's done to grow a better harvest. And we can have all sorts of arguments about quality now. And I think that there's interesting arguments to be made there. But in terms of quantity, that breeding efforts and doing these things, increasing the intensification of farming,
Mm.
there's all sorts of similar processes. But growing indoors is a pretty extreme example of increasing the intensification of farming.
I like that phrasing. That is exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
Intensifying it. Speaking of intensifying, you talk about the differences between indoor and outdoor. You talk about the climate, airflow differences, but then immediately you bring up the sun.
Yeah.
And the sun, like I said, is kind of what inspired this whole episode. And there's so much talk around the sun versus this grow light. Nothing beats the sun. Our grow light is closest to the sun. Our grow light mimics the sun.
Yeah.
I know it's free. I know that it's nice and powerful to grow big organic buds outside for free.
Yep.
So that's a big benefit. But just talk to me about how we should be thinking about the sun while growing outdoors. Talk to me about how plants interact with the sun and like that, eons old relationship, and how that differs from grow lights.
Yeah. So, the sun is an amazing, wonderful gift of energy and warmth and light, and it allows everything on this planet to live and survive, largely through plants' ability to harness the energy and photons and create sugars and create, everything that all the rest of life is basically built upon.
Right.
So plants have a long sort of evolutionary history of being exposed to the sun and of sort of, maximizing that energy transfer. The reality of sunlight in like really sunny locations, they get a lot of sun. So lower latitudes, bright sunny day, towards the middle of the day, you're going to get PPFDs at or above 2,000 micromoles per square meter.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's like double what we need inside a tent, like a little over double.
Yeah. It's double basically what plants can efficiently use at the carbon dioxide levels that they're experiencing outdoors. So plants basically have to protect themselves from that additional light. And one of the things that I never hear indoor growers who are talking about mimicking nature, right, is like, I'm going to start my plants at like 100 ppfd and gradually ramp that up to 2,000 and then leave it there for a few hours and then ramp it back down. There's these sunset and sunrise modes that a lot of grow lights or grow light controllers have that sort of play off of this idea that plants need to be kind of woken up with gradually increasing light and put back to sleep with gradually decreasing light. And that it's not really mimicking sort of the PPFD experience that plants have outdoors, though.
Yeah, but it's part of it. That's really interesting what you said. I don't mean to interrupt, but one of the things you said on a
Yeah.
previous episode
Yeah.
that has always stuck with me is
Okay.
that 2000 ppfd coming from the sun is coming from a single focal point. You can lift up your thumb and block it out.
Yes.
And you talked about how plants have the ability to angle their leaves
Yeah.
so that they don't saturate it. That blew my mind because I see
Yeah.
I see so many overlit plants indoors in veg, and they can't turn their leaves away. The LED takes up the entire ceiling. The whole ceiling is lights.
Yep. And the reflective walls are surprisingly like effective lights too, right? Like you go in there and look at the reflective wall, it's bright underneath the light. So yeah, light's coming at them from everywhere. Exactly. Yeah, the plants have ways to sort of survive that. Changing their leaf angle is a big one outdoors. And it's only a few hours that they kind of have to get through that. So they're not kind of
Right.
dealing with the whole time the lights are on. And if they were, plants would be evolved differently. Basically, plants can't be evolved to be sort of super efficient at 2000 ppfd because that's not the condition that they're sort of most likely to experience most of the time.
Right.
And so if they were optimized for 2000 ppfd, they're going to have a lot of receptors that are often not being used. And that's just biologically expensive to build that infrastructure if it's only rarely used. So it's evolved for a lower level of light. And when there's excessive light, they sort of avoid it. And when there's not enough light, they go kind of hunting for it, right? And really open their leaves and try to find it. So they have to be evolved for that midpoint, which is going to be the optimal, the evolutionary optimum.
At this distance from the sun. So maybe if we were growing plants on Venus, that ppfd would spike higher.
Yeah, if we experienced, noontime ppfds of 4,000,
Right.
then the plants would probably be efficient closer to like 2,000, right? Because that would be kind of the midpoint where you can't optimize for the maximum because you're just not going to often achieve that maximum. So what happens outdoors is in the morning and in the evening, the plants are getting less light than they could actually use. And in the middle of the day, they're getting more light than they can actually use.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's not much they can do during the morning and the night. They get what they can. And then, in the tropics or whatever, in the lower latitudes on sunny days, they start avoiding light during the middle parts of the day, or they have, desert plants and other things are evolved to not absorb too much light. So in an indoor setting, we just sort of understand what's the plant's optimal point of photosynthesis?
You're never gonna
Where are
mimic
the
that.
receptors sort of set up? And
Yeah.
we just give that to them all the time. So they don't ever have to kind of be underlit, and they don't ever have to be avoiding light. You don't want to give your plant so much light that it has to go into those photo protection measures. But we can do that. And that's why we measure ppfd. And that's why, eventually grow light designers started designing lights to distribute that density of light across the canopy and what the plants can sort of be optimized for. That's one of the ways that we grow plants faster indoors is we're able to give them better light over the whole sort of lights on period. The other thing that the sun doesn't really do this, but the planet is spinning. So the sun has the appearance of moving across the sky.
Right.
And plants can't necessarily, they're not fully phototropic where they kind of move to follow the sun. So they do that somewhat. Cannabis plants do that somewhat. But basically, having a steady, fixed overhead lighting source delivering the perfect ppfd all of the time is just far more efficient
Right.
than having a mobile single point light source that, delivers not enough light for half of the time and too much light for the other portion of the time.
Those are two totally different things. It's a really good way to look at it, Dr. Coco. You explained that very well. And there is no light manufacturer who ever could or who would ever want to mimic that. Honestly, it should be on random mode if you're going to mimic it. Maybe a storm passes today and half the light goes out. Or maybe it's way too sunny. It's the consistency and the evenness that actually is better.
Now, plants are able to deal with temporary issues like that, right? So like if you're growing in a room or a tent and say you have a big 4x8 tent, you got two lights, like one on either side, and one light goes out for whatever reason, right? The plants aren't going to really bat an eye at that. If that light's just out for a day,
Yeah.
the other light comes on and it's just going to be a cloudy day for that plants on that side of the tent. Like they're evolved to handle changing light conditions on a day-by-day basis. And it's not going to upset them.
Yeah, that is an important note.
Yeah, but we don't want to do that on purpose.
Exactly.
Plants aren't looking to have a rainy day every once in a while. And they're like, oh my God, it's never rained. And now I'm an unhappy plant, or I'm not going to produce as much cannabinoids. It really helps to think about plants like they're sort of biological pumps. And they really just respond to the conditions that they're found in. I think it's easy to anthropomorphize them or give them kind of feelings and thoughts,
personify
and
them,
desires, and what they want or whatever. But they're really just biological pumps pumping water from the soil up into the air. And like that's how most of the movement of everything happens within the plant. And they're responding to the different conditions that they're given.
That's exactly right. I think you can personify and they're unique and you can love them. But when it comes to how they behave,
right,
you're absolutely right. We tend to like give all these like nuances to processes that maybe not the way we look at them.
SD microbes, baby. SDmicrobeworks.com, code GROWCAST to get you savings on the greatest compost and soil mix in the world, if I do say so myself. SD Microbes is powered by their amazing BioVast vermicompost. It is the most powerful and diverse compost that I have personally found out there on the market, and this thing will supercharge your soil no matter how you grow. Or just grab their water-only soil mix. Not only does it have the BioVast loaded into it, but it's actually a Coco-based mix. I'm using this Coco living soil in my Earthbox sub-irrigated planter, and I could not be happier with the results. It's absolutely amazing. It's got great water holding capacity. It's absolutely perfect for a sub-irrigated planter. And whatever style you're running, SDmicrobeworks.com, they've got a bunch of great stuff up there. Again, use code GROWCAST for savings. Andrew is absolutely amazing. If you're in the SoCal area, hit him up. He'll deliver. He'll work with you. He'll get the soil in your hands, or just hit up that website. It is absolutely worth it. And of course, members getting 35% off in membership. That's right, a bunch of members gearing up for the Grand Pheno Hunt starting 2/15. That's right, February 15th. And a lot of people are using SD microbes in SIP systems. It's what we've been recommending for a while. Hunt those strains and see how they come out. Absolutely fire out of this grow style. So check it out, sdmicrobeworks.com. Make sure that you're following us. Make sure you're in membership. Go to growcast.com, our brand new website, and make sure to stay tuned for that Grand Pheno Hunt as well, growcast.com/hunt. Thank you to SD Microbes. Thank you to Andrew. Go check them out. You will not regret plugging that BioVast compost into your system. sdmicrobeworks.com, code GROWCAST. Members get 35% off.
Back to the light thing. This is really important. So you talk about the distribution of light, essentially the quantity of light, the timing of light. What about the quality? Because this is something that, again, I hear a lot. Nothing beats the sun. Our grow light is the same as the sun. Talk to me about like spectrum and then just overall quality of light, sun versus grow light.
Yeah. So this is, it's an interesting one. There's no question that the sunlight is different in terms of, spectral output than grow lights are. It produces a lot more far red light, richer full spectrum light in the greens and yellows. The reality is most LED grow lights have a bimodal distribution. So there's two spikes in their spectral output, one at about 450 nanometers. And that's because there are 450 nanometer semiconductors driving the full spectrum diodes. So almost all full spectrum white diodes have 450 nanometer semiconductors. And even though a lot of their light is kind of pushed to longer wavelengths, and that's why it appears white, they all have a spike at 450 because of that semiconductors generating all the photons at that range. And then grow lights use a lot of 660 nanometer LEDs, which produce light exactly at 660 nanometers. And so you get a spike at 450 and a spike at 660. Now that's not entirely by accident. I mean, it's a little bit of a lucky circumstance, but the plants actually sort of respond. The McCree response curve, which was mapped out in the 70s, sort of like how plants use different wavelengths of light, suggested that they used blue light a little bit more efficiently than green and yellow lights, and red light more efficiently than green and yellow light. So that they're also sort of those two spikes. And that corresponds to kind of how the different photosystems within the plants harvest different wavelengths of light.
Wow.
So yeah, there's two photosystems 1 and 2, and they're sort of geared towards different wavelengths. If you provide monochromatic light, you won't activate both of them. And that's why like the old blurple lights had blue light and red light.
Whoa.
So they'd activate both photosystems and make the plant sort of work.
That's fascinating. So if you just grow under like straight green light or one single
or
spectrum.
straight red light or straight blue light, you
Wow.
will not get as efficient photosynthesis. But if you grow with blue light and red light, you'll activate both photosystems instead of just one or the other.
Never understood that. That's amazing.
Yeah. And the ratio between them is important too. If the ratio shifts towards blue, then the plants tend to be shorter, stockier. It actually affects how the cells develop. So the cells themselves become sort of squatter cells, shorter cells. And if you're exposed to more red light, or the ratio of red is higher, then the cells elongate. So when you're thinking about internodal distances, the same number of cells, if they're shorter, squatter, translates into shorter internodal spacing. But if you get these elongated cells, then you get sort of longer internodal spacing. And oftentimes that's less desirous during veg. So the ratio of red to blue matters. The other sort of complicating factor in that is that red light is cheaper than blue light. So grow light manufacturers would generally prefer to use red light
Of
because
course.
you get more of it per each watt of electricity that you invest. But if you put too much red light, then that causes vegetating plants to stretch.
Can we just pause and appreciate how crazy that is and how fascinating the phenomenon is that you saturate a living being with a different frequency of photon energy and it changes the cell structure to be more or less squat?
Yeah.
That's some crazy shit. Score
Yeah.
one for the the frequency hippy dippy people, because that's like that's like magic to me, man. That's crazy.
It is. And any growers can sort of play around with this. You know, if you want to get your plants to get stretchier, people often ask, like, and let me just say, to get back to your original question about sort of how spectrum and outdoor and all this
Mhm.
affects plants, we have this photosystem thing. We need to activate both photosystems, right? And to sort of fully saturate photosynthesis. But as far as photosynthesis is concerned, there doesn't appear to be much more that, you know, if we're providing adequate red and blue light, providing yellow and green photons aren't going to do much more in terms of photosynthesis at that point.
We're sure of this. The science is settled on this.
Yeah, well, this is some of the stuff that Bugbee and his students are sort of actively probing and researching and doing different tests at different spectrums and changing spectrums at different times during the grow period. And
That's cool.
they keep kind of coming back with, especially during the flowering period, that changing the spectrum during the flowering period doesn't have appreciable, quantitative, measurable impacts on harvest quality. So on cannabinoids or terpenes or other things like that, or in harvest size, or really in anything that they're able to measure, changing spectrum. So increasing the ratio of red light, increasing the ratio of blue light, using only certain wavelengths of light, as long as you're still activating both photosystems.
Wow.
During vegetative growth, it affects cell structure, as we discussed. But plants don't sort of grow the same way during flowering. That's why we used to switch. I've said this a lot because growers always think that this is different. Growers often think that we switch when we used to grow under metal halide and HPS, that we did that because, I think that the idea is metal halide was cheaper, but HPS was better for flowering.
Is that right?
That's what people think, I think, but it's exactly wrong. Metal halide isn't cheaper. It's more expensive. HPS is better, but HPS is too much red. So you can't use HPS during veg.
Because it stretches your plants out. That's what I was always told, is the metal halide builds the structure and then HPS is for flower. That's what I was told.
Yeah, HPS has a red, much more red in its metal halide lights have more blue signature, more blue sort of a spectral output, less red. So plants grow shorter, stalker. But metal halide bulbs don't last as long. They aren't as efficient. So you don't get as much light per watt of electricity. And they were sort of used to prevent plants from stretching. But growers think that HPS had some sort of better spectrum for flowering, but it really just had more light per watt.
Right.
So you'd get more light, and that's why you'd get a better harvest. Now, there's more to it. There's other non-photosynthetic plant signaling, other wavelengths of light can do other things potentially, and there's room for this. So we can't ever say that, that argument about sunlight being qualitatively better for whatever reason, it's hard to systematically show every single whatever reason isn't true.
Hey, listen, I hear I hear an answer to that, Dr. Coco. That does sound like what you're saying is there is something very special about the sun that is very hard to mimic.
Yes, but whether or not it's important to mimic it, just like whether or not it's important to mimic, a
Sure.
rocky soil, is it important to have rocks in your pot? Rocks exist in the ground in nature, right? Or is this, is it important to have your light move across the sky or these other issues? How important is that, or what does that do? I'm of the opinion, based on the research that's been sort of returned so far, is that there's nothing really super magical in the spectrum itself. They've tested a lot of different, treatments with infrared exposures, with ultraviolet exposures. Almost all of that either leads to no, measurable improvement or
Small
a
ones.
measurable decline in quality.
Sure. Okay.
So it seems unlikely. And our ability to manipulate spectrum is radically improving. As recently as the 90s and the early 2000s, we were really limited in terms of even being able to generate specific spectrums of light. But with improvements in semiconductor technologies now, we can generate a lot of really specific wavelengths of light that we've never been able to do, and have more control and test different things. So we will learn more about spectrum and potentially be able to improve grow lights in that regard. I think that I don't know. I guess I'm a bit of a non-optimist in that regard, in terms of sort of uncovering something that's super transformational.
Well, I mean, like you said, we already grow outside.
Right.
I think that people laser focus in on certain things and are like, this is the thing that's going to make my weed, like you said, magically danker.
Right.
Whether it's adding UV lights, whether it's boosting their CO2 or some secret high stress training method. I don't think it really works like that. I think it's much more multifaceted and it's a lot more boring.
Yeah.
So it's about consistency and being in your garden every day. And we tend to look for these magical solutions. But that being said, I'm sure, like you said, there's so much more science and work to be done. I just don't think it's going to take your mids and turn it into dank. You know what I'm
not.
saying?
And let me comment on a couple of wavelengths. This is stuff that I'm going to get into on that diodes video that I was talking about. Ultraviolet light, there's really, okay, so even if you're trying to mimic the sun, there's no UVC and there's really no UVB that reach the planet. And there's really small quantities of UVA that reach the surface of the planet.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's all filtered out in the atmosphere. So if you think there's some sort of mimicking nature thing about dosing your plants with UVB light, that doesn't happen in nature. UVB light is really damaging cell structures. And so to the extent that it's doing anything, the route through which it's doing it is by damaging cell structures and maybe plant response, but there's no evidence that that helps cannabis plants.
Oh, I was just going to ask you this because I see people, posting science about it and trying it in their grow. And to me, it seems like one of those things that we just discussed where if it's having a positive change, I think it's a marginal one is what I'll say.
Yeah, a lot of the studies that have dosed their plants and done it in a controlled environment and measured cannabinoids showed that there's a decrease and trying to do it at different timings or whatever. And there's this idea in the community that, well, you do it for 2 hours at different times of the day or something. You don't do it all the time. I don't see any good science that's supporting those ideas. These are just growers and grow light companies, to be perfectly honest with you, trying to sell something to growers that are trying to buy something to solve problems that they think they may have.
Well, that comes pretty honest from you, man, because you have an affiliate code for those lights and you could have your own Dr. UV. So
exactly.
when you come out and say something like that, whether or not someone agrees with you, at least you can't argue you're being intellectually honest here.
And the supplemental light bars that put both UV and IR chips on the same board make absolutely no sense to me.
Why is that?
Because just turning on UV and IR, you wouldn't use them the same way. Like I just said, like the leading idea about how to use UV would just be short durations during the day.
Got it.
And you would use IR either consistently during the day or alone right after the lights go out. But you wouldn't want the UV to come on kind of in either of those situations. So I don't understand why you would put UV chips and IR chips on the same channel of the same light bar.
Sure. I didn't mean to laugh. That was a really funny statement. You were like, don't get me started on putting UV chips on the same board as far. That's a very nerdy statement. I love it.
There's some interesting things you can do with these supplemental light bars. And, I've been playing around with a couple recently. I got a 730 nanometer bar that I've been thinking about using to sundown my plants and see if I can reduce the dark period. I got a 660 nanometer bar that you can add during flowering to have sort of a cheaper source of light, things like that. But yeah, and I'm playing around with this also because I'm really trying to gain that experience, to have a better platform to speak about these different individual spectrums of light. But so far, if you're looking at grow lights in particular, I don't like grow lights that include UV chips and run them while the rest of the chips are just on.
I didn't even know that was a thing. Isn't that bad for you?
It's bad for you. It depends, man. A lot of them are just 395 nanometer chips. So they're technically UV, but they're close enough to the sort of 400 is the visible light UV sort of cutoff point, or ultraviolet cutoff point. So they're basically violet diodes, but those violet diodes, the 395s, are so much less efficient than the 450s.
Sure.
The 450s are some of the most efficient semiconductors that we know how to make in terms of energy transfer. They are the most efficient in terms of energy transfer.
Whoa.
But the 395s are just not very efficient in terms of energy transfer. So they are doing some photosynthesis. They're within the photosynthetic range, even though they're technically outside of par. 395 nanometers is doing photosynthesis. So you are getting benefit. But I think you'd be a lot better off just using, a 450 nanometer diode or just another white diode for that matter.
Getting it more light.
As opposed to you'd get a lot more light, bigger bang for your buck. And I don't think that there's some super secret thing that 395 nanometer light is doing. At least none of the science shows that. It's true that if you go to the 450 nanometer semiconductors, you don't get any 395 nanometer light. When they put the 450 semiconductors into a white diode, basically they're using phosphor in the glue usually to redirect some of those blue towards longer wavelengths. They basically knock some of the energy off of them. So they become a longer wavelength photon, but they can't make them shorter wavelength photons. So as it travels through sort of the phosphor in the glue, a lot of the 450s become 600 somethings, but they can't become 300 somethings. energy just doesn't you can take energy away from something, but you can't give it in that way.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you're not getting it. And I understand the idea that, hey, there could be something in the plant that's only sensitive to like 403 nanometer light and, or whatever. And it's just, we don't, I mean, it could be. And that's what I'm saying. It's really hard to show that that's not true.
Right.
But we don't have any evidence to suggest that it is true. Because if we tested like the 403, then it'd be like, oh, it's actually, we were wrong. It's 402. And then we'd have to test 402. And then be like, you can't show that it's not any of these things each individually. I mean, it'd be hard to do that.
And it's the magic bullet approach, right? Like, I think the truth often lies in like the interactions between these systems. Like outdoor is a perfect example of that. Like nature, we tend to break it down in our heads as best we can as humans to try to make sense of things, like, right? But there is so much going on and so much evolution behind these things that have been on this planet way before us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that's what I think we're really trying to do as indoor horticulturalists is we're trying to understand how these plants evolved in nature, understand how they work, and then be able to provide to them the optimal conditions to sort of allow them to work best, allow them to grow and put most of their energy into the parts of the plant that we're most interested in harvesting. And the idea there is we'll take care of the rest, right? We'll defend you from pest infestation. You don't need to defend yourself. We'll make sure that you have enough phosphorus. You don't have to go looking for it, right? We'll make sure that you have everything, the right climate. You don't have to become hardier and thicker bark or thicker cell walls to defend yourself from bigger swings in temperatures because you're not going to have to experience that. We're going to take care of that for you.
That veal life. I hear you loud and clear, Dr. Coco. You're going to get a steak after this. I know exactly.
The veal lifestyle, exactly.
He's a vegetarian, folks, or he doesn't eat red meat.
Yeah, I don't eat red meat.
Dude, this was a great exploration. I want to give you time to like wrap up any thoughts here at the end. Like this episode was fan-fucking-tastic. All your episodes are great, but this is a subject I've wanted to dive into for a while, and you did a phenomenal job. Before we get into plugs and updates, do you have any like final thoughts on growing outside, inside, the sun, lights, anything?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the speed versus cheap thing, right? It's a lot cheaper to grow outdoors. It takes a lot more time, and you're sort of thinking about your investment and your returns differently. In outdoor growing, you're investing land and you're investing time primarily, right? And in indoor growing, you're investing labor and you're investing energy. And since we're growing, more energy and more labor into the same sort of amount of space, we can grow a much bigger crop a lot faster, but it's way more expensive. And I think that those are sort of the biggest decision makers or thoughts between this. One other interesting thought is I kind of wish cannabis was grown outdoors.
No kidding.
Yeah, from a strictly sustainability standpoint,
yes,
I think it's a disaster to grow cannabis indoors. It's a plant, it grows really well outdoors. And the main reason we grow it indoors is legal. At one point, it was to hide from, the man.
The police, yeah.
Yeah, it's often regulated to do it that way. Or it's state by state markets where you're growing this crop in a state that's not really suitable to grow cannabis, or certainly not suitable to grow cannabis year round.
Well, I mean, ours isn't year round, but it's illegal for these legal, what am I trying to say? The large scale licensed cultivators here, they cannot grow outdoors. Like in the good months, they're not allowed to.
Right. So it forces us indoors, which that's where I try to really carve my niche in the market is like, okay, if we're going to be growing indoors, let's try to do this as efficiently as possible.
Damn right.
Let's really try to do this it's not sustainable. Growing indoor horticulture is never going to be sustainable. But, in terms of the hardcore definition of that, but let's try to make it as sustainable as possible. Let's try to speed up the time to harvest, lower the amount of inputs that we're using, and maximize our returns to the energy that we're investing in the grow rather than, maximize our returns to the land or whatever you're going to think about in terms of outdoor growing. This is why I think that, rather than plant count limits in states, they should do electrical caps. you have a 400, megawatt cap or
Totally.
whatever, and you grow as much as you freaking can, but that's your limit. You can't, and that would force growers to economize to power use. That would force them to grow more efficiently. And more of them would bring me business because more of them would come look and sort of provide advice about how to do that.
That would be fascinating, man. Or let them grow outside, like you said.
Yeah.
How about that? That's
So
crazy.
in the end, I say a lot of good things about indoor horticulture because I figure, if we're going to be doing this thing, we got to figure out how to do it as good as we possibly can and, minimize our negative impacts and maximize the size and the speed to harvest.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Really,
Outdoor
really good
growers,
thinking.
my heart's with you. I love you guys. You're doing the God's work out there, being farmers under the sun. And I kind of wish that cannabis came that way. It's slower, but it's much cheaper, much less
It's
impact.
fun too. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, I love growing indoors. Growing indoors is fucking fun. There's nothing like being able to step away from my computer into my garden.
Right.
But
I
growing
agree with
outdoors,
that too.
growing outdoors is a special kind of fun.
Yeah. And, that's the way we should go. I don't know. With a lot of things, I think that it's a little bit silly how much cannabis needs to be grown indoors, like the legal regime, like you're talking about,
Yeah.
not letting licensed
Why?
facility. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Here in San Diego County, where I live, home growers are allowed to have 6 plants in a tent inside, but not even in a fenced yard or whatever outside. It
Oh, that's
can't be done.
lame.
It's totally lame. And it kind of forces us where we have the ideal climate to be able to do this outdoors. We're not legally allowed to do it. We're sort of legally forced to quote unquote recreate the sun, right? Inside our tents. So yeah, I think that there's arguments on both sides. There's a lot of advantages to growing outdoors, but if we are going to grow indoors, I think we need to figure out how to optimize it, not just how to sort of somewhat mimic outdoors.
That's great. And that's where the work is to be done. Like you said, that's where there's work to be done there. Really quickly, before we wrap it up, I got to tell you about my current run. Just take 2 minutes, Dr. Coco.
Do it.
You talk about the indoor and the labor part. I'm a really big fan of these SIP systems, these sub-irrigated planters.
Yep. Okay.
And what do I have on the inside for my living soil medium? A living cocoa.
Nice.
SD Microbes makes a living cocoa, and this thing works so fucking good in a sip because it wicks so well, Coco.
Yeah.
You talk about the many powers of cocoa, and one of the things it does really well is wicks super well. And dude, the plants look great. The thing drinks faster than a regular sip, a peat sip. And I just had to shout you out for a cocoa run, a living cocoa run, man. It's fucking
a living cocoa. I love it.
It's just everything. Like you said, there's work to be done. There's so much innovation. People like combining styles and stuff.
Yep.
And I had to tell you, I'm growing in cocoa. I'm growing in cocoa for the first time in a long time. So
that's cool. I'm glad to hear that. I'd love to hear more about your living cocoa adventure. How far are you from harvesting that crop?
I'm about to flip. And I put them in looking so sick because they've been in solo cups for like 10 weeks. And they just look so
Solo
good now.
cups for 10 weeks. Is that your SOP?
Oh, yeah. That's actually, I got a resource coming out on how to keep solo cups pissed off.
Yeah, wow.
No, it was just laziness.
A solo cup for 10 weeks by Jordan.
Yeah, totally. Pure laziness, dude. Neglected them. And
I know how that
and
goes.
it gets to that point where you're like, is this thing going to even bounce back? But sure enough, they did. It's the magic of cocoa, baby. Okay, Dr. Coco, tell us where to find you, where to go. Give us plugs before we wrap it up.
All right, so check me out on YouTube, of course, Dr. MJ Coco on YouTube. I dropped a new video just a week ago. I'm going to be doing this new diodes video, new grow light test, doing the new tent heat factor and the operating cost metrics and talking all about that. So check out those videos. Check me out on cocoforcannabis.com, of course, my website where we have a huge community of growers, active 24-hour chat room where you can drop in and ask questions about your plants. And where we're gearing up for the new New Year's Grow Challenge. It's going to start on January 1st, 2025. We'd love to invite you to grow your plants with us. So come on over and check us out at Coco for Cannabis.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Coco. You rock, man. Let's stay in touch, yeah?
Absolutely. Let's stay in touch, Jordan. Love coming on Growcast. It's the best cannabis growing podcast out there. And always a privilege and an honor
Oh, thank
to
you.
come on with you.
Thank you, bro. Be well out there. Go enjoy your veal steak, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you, all you listeners, for tuning in. CocoForCannabis.com, GrowcastPodcast.com. You know where to find us. We're all over the place. Stay tuned. And special thank you to the members. We'll see you next time, everybody. This is Dr. Coco and Jordan River signing off saying be safe out there and grow smarter. Bye-bye.
Grower love.
That's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Dr. Coco. One more time, shout out to the Grand Pheno Hunt. It's the best contest we've ever put on, and you need to be a part of it. Growcast.com/hunt has the details. Go and check it out. You can grow any genetics in this hunt. We're hunting through the entire membership's gene pool, and someone is going to win $1,000 cash grand prize. Growcast.com/hunt. All the information is up there. Go and check it out. Go check out the new website. And we are so excited to host you in the Grand Pheno Hunt. Rooted Leaf Nutrients. Shout out to Rooted Leaf for sponsoring the show. RootedLeaf.com code GROWCAST for 20% off. The 42% code might still be boosted. Go check it out. Maybe it's still live, but I'm pretty sure it's 20% off right now at the time you're hearing this at RootedLeaf.com. Thank you to Rooted Leaf for supporting the show. And thank you, dear listener. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate the members so much. I'll see you guys in membership. I'm going to go hop in voice chat right now. And be well out there, everybody. Be safe. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
I'm famous for bringing up corn.